Hey guys, I'm Nathan from Arms and Armor. I was recently talking to a buddy of mine about how awesome the Golden Age of Piracy was, and it got me thinking about which swords in the Oakeshott collection and which swords that we've made at Arms and Armor fit into this time period. Now, the Golden Age of Piracy was really from about 1650 to 1730. There were pirates before and after that. But that was really the period of time when there was huge amounts of wealth moving around the world due to British and Spanish colonial control. And there were a lot of pirates out there preying on all of this treasure. So today, I've got a bunch of swords from the Oakeshott Institute collection. I want to show you guys. These are original antique pieces that kind of span the gamut of this time period. So the first sword I want to show you is from a period probably actually just right before the so-called Golden Age of Piracy. Right, so this is an early 17th century rapier, so from probably right around the year 1600. And this was probably an officer's sword or a civilian sword. You can see this thing is a beast. The blade from the ricasso is 46 inches long. You can see the complex hilt here with all of this hand file work in it. Now, this kind of sword would have been in use. They were very popular in Spain and Italy. And Spain was one of the main powers that was moving gold in vast amounts across both the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. So something like this would not have been out of character for Spanish officers to wear, but it wouldn't have been a common piece for sailors for a couple of reasons. One is that it is so long, right? Fighting with these rapiers was really a kind of gentlemanly affectation in certain ways. It's a dangerous weapon, but it's also a weapon that was really hard to learn how to use effectively. And these super long rapiers like this one were a bit of an affectation, right? You held these out way in front of you. When you fought with them, it kept your opponent at a significant distance. You can imagine if you have two guys with rapiers with 4-foot blades, and then, they've got 30 inches of arm sticking out there. That's, 7.5 feet of arm and blade sticking out. And then if someone else is opposing you, that means you have a span of 12 or 14 feet between the people who are fighting with these things. That's a big distance, particularly if you're on a sailing ship. There's not a lot of space for people to be having rapier duels on the decks of these boats, right? So if these were worn during the early part of the Golden Age of Piracy, it was probably mostly for show by high-ranking officers or worn as a kind of dress sword, right? The word rapier probably comes from the Spanish Spadroon, means dress sword, right? So ambassadors, whatever. So if you're looking back to your Errol Flynn movies and they're fighting with rapiers, maybe the Spanish captains wore rapiers, maybe some of the English captains wore rapiers, but most of the sailors weren't fighting with anything like this. The next sword I want to show you is a transitional rapier. Right? We call this a transitional rapier because it has a rapier hilt, but the blade is much shorter. So the blade on this is 31 inches, right, as opposed to 46. It's a much shorter sword. This one is a bit later, solidly within the time period of the Golden Age of Piracy. Right? This guy is probably, I would say, late 17th century, so like 1670s, something like that. It's from Spain. It's marked Sahagún as the maker, S-A-H Sahagun, Sahagun, who's a famous maker in Toledo. This one, there were various Sahaguns making swords for 150 years, so this is not the original Sahagun. But it's a lovely sword. Now, one of the things that makes this more useful during the Golden Age of Sail is you can wear it and it doesn't drag on the ground. That other one, it's a huge sword, right? It wouldn't actually drag, but you'd have to have it levered out behind you so that it wouldn't. And you'd risk getting tangled up on the ship, getting tangled up in rigging, in close quarters. If you've worn a rapier that's 4 feet long, if you try and turn around, your sword hits people, it tangles you up, it gets tied up. It's no good for being on a ship. This guy, you could use in a similar manner. It has a similar aesthetic, but it doesn't get in the way, right? So you can really actually fight with this and move without needing to be 10 feet away from your opponent. It's a more useful sword on a ship, right? Which is where, during the Golden Age of Piracy, if we're thinking about naval stuff, that's where all this fighting is happening, where people are prepared for boarding actions, where they're fighting against pirates, or they're pirates fighting with merchantmen or naval officers or sailors. So you want to be able to use your sword in confined spaces. So this transitional rapier, plausible, right? This could be a reasonable pirate sword. It was also high prestige, it was fancy. Look at all this piercing work. All of those are hand-drilled holes that are then hand-filed into squares. So this was an expensive sword, took a lot of labor. Pirates liked their bling, right? So did officers. So if you captured this sword as a pirate, you probably want to wear it to show how cool you are. Next is a small sword, right? So this small sword has a typical small sword hilt, which is a simple knuckle ring, these little finial ends, and a symmetrical cup hilt guard in there with a small pommel. These swords are very light, so this small sword weighs a few ounces less even than that transitional rapier. These were popular from the late 17th right up through the 18th century, so which is absolutely within the Golden Age of Piracy and certainly within the Golden Age of Sail. These were dueling swords. They were officers' swords and gentlemen's swords, but they would have been reasonably practical on a ship, although they have, you can see this cross section of this blade, it's not even particularly sharp out here. It's strictly for stabbing. So it would be of limited utility on a ship where you might have to cut through rigging, through ropes, that kind of thing. This would have been more likely a dress sword for someone who didn't expect that they were immediately going into some kind of naval action. Now, here's a Spadroon. Right, so this Spadroon is also from the early middle of the 18th century, so getting toward the end of the Golden Age of Piracy, but definitely we're talking tall ship sailing around the world, lots of naval combat. This, you can see the faceted kind of urn pommel, the 5-ball motif, which is very common, decorative motif on these swords. This is the same length as that transitional rapier. The blade's 31 inches, right? So it's something you can use in close quarters combat for sure. It's light, it has a thick back, so it's quite rigid. It's good for thrusting, but it also has an edge, which means you can cut with it. At the same time, this isn't a super powerful cutting sword, right? You can cut, but you're not going to be lopping through, big 3-inch pieces of hemp rope without really trying. I mean, you could, but it's not the ideal tool for that. But it's a sword that moves really well with some compromises, right? You can cut, you can thrust, it looks good. This one You can see how it has a ring only on the outside. That allows it, when it's in your scabbard, to lay flat against your body, which is nice. It takes up less space than a bigger sword, which is a practical consideration if you're on a sailing ship. I actually love this sword. I think that it is fast and elegant and smooth, and it feels amazing. Next, there's this hanger. Now, the difference between a hanger and a cutlass is pretty semantic. I would argue that hangers are often used on land and cutlasses are kind of thought of as naval swords, but really we're talking about a very similar kind of thing. This is a beautifully preserved English hanger. You can see the piercing work on the blade. The hilt is all silvered. These are the jeweler's marks. We know it was made in London. This sword was custom made for somebody. Here you can see the moon, some stars, another moon down there on the blade. And the blade length, 31 inches, right? A nice length. You can move, you can wear it. It's not gonna get tangled up in rigging. But this thing, if you need to cut through, some big thick hemp ropes, or if you're repelling borders, this sword would be ideally suited for that. So when we see depictions of pirates, especially from the late 17th and early 18th centuries, they often have a sword whose blade looks kind of like this. Now, these were often also civilian swords. So riding swords were often hangers that you would wear as a civilian to protect yourself, especially if you're going on a trip, right? If you're riding through the Black Forest, you wear your riding sword. If you're in a carriage, right, you might have this sword with you in the carriage, and it's short enough that you can fight in close quarters with it. It's light, but this blade geometry with this, you've got 10 inches of sharp false edge on the back, you've got this acute point, and this edge is very fine, which means that this sword is gonna cut like a laser. All right, so this sword is very good for close quarters combat, and if I were a pirate, this is the sword that I would choose for sure, unless I was a really fancy, captain, then maybe I'd have something a little more sparkly like a rapier. But this sword I think is ideal for shipboard actions. Finally, I have one more thing to show you guys, and this is kind of cool. This is, I believe it's a 1794 midshipman's dirk. It's 94, 96, very end of the 18th century. It's still got its scabbard, which is pretty cool. And this is essentially a fighting knife that's also useful as a tool on deck, this heavily curved blade, which makes it good for slashing. This thing, the blade, is about 15, 16 inches long, which makes it quite small. It's got this cool dragon on it. This chain knuckle guard was something that was pretty common in the 18th century, especially the second half of it. If we're thinking any time really from let's say French and Indian Wars up through the Napoleonic Wars, American Revolution, swords that have this kind of chain, it's mostly a decorative motif that's really not going to protect your knuckles very much. It gives you a little bit of protection against some kinds of cuts, but really nothing substantial. So it's a decorative thing that kind of hang and catch the sun. You can see that it has this texture on it that makes it look kind of like gold wire. It's, I think it's brass on there. But another cool naval piece, these dirks initially were straighter, then they got curved. It's just fashion, which kind of blade was popular at the time. So check out the photos of some swords that we've made at Arms and Armor that kind of correspond with this golden age of piracy. And I guess I have to say, arr. All right, thank you. Take care.